Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Right, welcome everyone to today's Title Topics webinar. These are ALTA's free presentations we offer every month on issues important to title and settlement professionals. I am Jeremy Yowie, Alta's Vice President of Communications, and today we've got a great webinar lined up to help you learn more about the uniform closing instructions, which were a collaborative effort between ALTA, MBA, and NISMO, the Mortgage Industry Standards Maintenance Organization. And today's content is definitely drew interest from you all. We nearly had about 1,000 people register, so thank you for taking some time out of your day. Before starting, I need to touch on a few housekeeping items. A copy of today's presentation can be downloaded from the handout section in the GoToWebinar pane. All participant lines are muted for the presentation. If you have a question, please submit them at the questions box and we'll hold some time at the end of the presentation for Q&A. As an added benefit, the presentation is being recorded. Once we've got the file processed, the recording will be available on Alta's website, and you can find that at alta.org/webinars. Again, that's alta.org/webinars. I do need to thank F&F Family of Companies for sponsoring our Title Topics webinars this year. Their support allows us to provide these educational opportunities free of charge. And now with that, let me introduce today's speakers. Both speakers have been and were heavily involved in the development of the templates from the start and offering guidance on why these are helpful, definitely from the title and settlement professional perspective as well. And so join us, we have Jim Lent here. Jim is Vice President of Title and Escrow at Home Services of America. And we also have Kate Steinman. She is Vice President Business Liaison Manager for Wells Fargo Home Mortgage. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jim to get us started.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. Kate and I are coming to you from snowy Minnesota, and I'm frankly a little disappointed because this year I actually bought a snowblower for the express purpose of making sure it didn't snow here in Minnesota this year. Apparently, no one got that memo. Welcome everybody to the seminar regarding the Uniform Lender Closing Instructions published by NISMO. I'm going to start off, talk a little bit about the history of the project, and then hand it over to Kate. We're going to go through some of the templates, kind of show you the principles behind those, give you a little glimpse at how the templates work, and then talk about what's next with respect to these from a NISMO perspective. So next slide, Jeremy. So the Uniform Lender Closing Instructions is an idea that's been around for several years, really since the introduction of the HUD-1 settlement statement. There have been multiple attempts over the, since the introduction of that HUD-1 to come up with uniform closing instructions, and Kate and I got involved in another attempt to do that, really in conjunction with an idea hashed by Justin Ailes, and it started at an Alta conference, really, when we were just the three of us talking about this. As part of that, Kate and Justin and I did a lot of research about what happened with the prior attempts. There were, I don't know how many, 3 or 4 prior attempts to come up with uniform closing instructions. And they all failed for various reasons, but the principal reason for each of the failures was that people agreed that the idea was a good idea, but when it came to putting words on the page for those instructions, the attorneys for the title industry and the attorneys for the lending industry started working at cross purposes and ultimately could not agree on language, and so as a result, the attempts to come up with uniform closing instructions failed. Kate and I and Justin agreed very early on that if this was going to be successful, we had to avoid that pitfall. And so, as you'll see going forward, there are no words on the page for these instructions. We understand that there will have to be for the instructions to be effective, but the idea is that we're not going to try to write the language for the lenders. We're going to tell them what concepts we want addressed, where in the document we want them addressed, and then give them some guidance on what we think should be discussed at each of those points in the instructions. We did this through using MISMO, the Mortgage Industry Standards Maintenance Organization, which is technically an affiliate of the Mortgage Bankers Association, but has participation from several different elements of the mortgage and closing industry. We did this. The platform, the group was called the Closing Instructions Development Work Group, which is a specific tool within MISMO. Development work groups are designated to achieve a specific goal, and when that goal is achieved, then the work group essentially disbands. We have achieved the original goal of the Closing Instructions Work Group, but the work group has actually taken on another project, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So the Closing Instructions Development Work Group still exists, but Kate and I's role in that process has diminished, and it will become pretty clear why going forward. Anyway, the work group that we had, it was a big work group. We had participation from a lot of different groups within our industry. There were several participants from the large national lenders. We had several folks from the settlement industry, both from the title companies and some of the escrow groups around the country. We had a lot of participation from the technical providers in the industry, both loan operating system vendors and title operating system vendors. And then we had a significant participation from those groups who actually prepare the documents, that prepare the closing instruction for the lenders. And that's groups like Wolters Kluwer and some others, law firms who draft closing instructions for lenders. Next slide, Jeremy. And the next one after that. So why are closing instructions important? As everybody here knows, closing instructions is the contract, the agreement for the closing services to be provided by the escrow officer or the escrow company for the lender. And those closing instructions make clear what the terms of that agreement are and what is expected of the parties with respect to that. So the lender there is going to be very clear about their conditions to close, any specific instructions, any funding conditions they have, what behaviors the escrow officer and the escrow company is supposed to be providing, how they want their documents signed, and how they want those handled post-closing. And so all of those, and then also in those instructions are any things that are specific to this transaction, the names of the parties, the property that's being secured, anything else that they have that is unique to that particular transaction. It tells essentially the closer how that lender wants their transaction handled for that particular closing. Next slide, please. So what are closing instructions? I mean, this is really the foundation of why we needed to address this. We did a survey. This is somewhat old now, probably 3 or 4 years old, but and this was an Alta survey. They found that each settlement agent worked with between 200 and 100 different lenders on a weekly basis. On average, that was about 35 lenders. The median number was 20. So everybody's working with a lot of different lenders. And what's the problem that causes is every lender has a different set of instructions. Those instructions might be provided by the loan operating system vendor, but they're all going to be very unique to that particular lending institution. A lot of times those are going to be written by lawyers for that institution. The way they are developed over time is each time that lender has a particular problem, they would write a clause in their loan instructions to address that particular problem, make sure that problem doesn't happen again. And as a result, the lending instructions were inconsistent in the order in which they addressed issues, inconsistent in the issues that got addressed in those instructions. When it came down to conditions, they were handled differently. Different investors did different things, had different requirements. And so today, it's in order to do a closing, you have to read every set of instructions for a new lender from beginning to end to make sure you've got the whole checklist of items that need to be taken care of, and have the contact information so that if you have any questions or your closer has any questions, they know who to call to answer those questions. Next slide, Jeremy. You've got different challenges that this brings up. You've got these wide varying formats and requirements. You have closing instructions that are oftentimes incomplete. Sometimes you have instructions that don't tell you who to contact if you have questions. The way our industry works, and this is, sometimes it's the fault of a disorganized lender. More often, it's a problem of having a borrower that didn't get the lender all the information they need. And so you get the instructions at the last minute, when you've got that borrower sitting in the closing room or your lobby waiting to close, and you've got a closer poring over those instructions at the last minute. What that does is it ramps up the pressure on that closer. It creates stress around the closing. Borrowers and consumers have a poor experience because things are late, things are last minute, and sometimes a little bit haphazard. As a result, you have a much more stressful and confusing closing than it needs to be. And this ultimately ends up in increases in errors, both prior to the closing, at the closing, and post-closing, resulting in a higher level of complaints from consumers, which reflects poorly on everybody involved in the transaction. And with the advent of some of the new legislation, can result in some pretty significant penalties. Next slide, and at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Kate to talk a little bit.
Great, thanks, Jim. And ironically, I too bought a snowblower this year, thinking I wouldn't need to use it, and here I am looking out the window at yet another winter wonderland. So apparently, both of us had spoiled attempts to try to keep it green a little bit longer here in Minnesota. But first and foremost, just thank you to ALTA for hosting this webinar today. This is something that Jim and I have been working on for quite a while. And we're really excited to be able to walk through how we got here, what it looks like, and where we're going next. So to add on from what Jim was talking about, you have all of the inconsistencies and last minute changes that are happening that are causing that poor consumer experience. And then you add TRID on top of that already growing risk. Lenders were now facing new regulatory risks, including requirements to refund, cure defects, remediate, and really what became evident to all involved, and I'm sure was very evident to all of you on the phone, is that the importance of clear and efficient communication between lenders and settlement agents was now more important than ever. Further complicating matters from a TRID perspective is that the responsibility for creation, generation of the borrower's CD lies solely with the lender. It took away the ability of settlement agents to make changes independently as needed, as once had been able to do with the HUD-1. So it resulted in closing instructions being delivered even more last minute, leaving very little time, as Jim alluded to before, for settlement agents to review these lengthy, complex, and often varied set of instructions. Next slide, please, Jeremy. I think it's interesting to talk about the fact that market conditions also accentuate the risk and the need for some consistency within this space. For instance, when rates rise, we move into a purchase-driven market. It results in lenders losing the ability to work with preferred settlement service providers, and now there's greater variability in lender to settlement agent interaction. With every lender having different instructions, the closing process has now been that much further complicated, and the need for clear, consistent instructions across lenders becomes even more important. Conversely, when rates fall, we hit the refi boom, as we all are keenly aware of right now. With this, closing volumes rise, and that generally happens quite suddenly and significantly. With that rise, you see an increase in the use of third-party originator lenders and new entrants in the mortgage market becoming more prominent, meaning settlement agents are dealing with more lenders and even more variation in closing instructions. Combine this with sheer increase in volume itself, and settlement agents are lacking that needed time to thoroughly review instructions. Rates are always either rising or falling, so this kind of constant churn is always in existence. Next slide, please, Jeremy. So let's talk consequences. Bottom line, varying instructions contribute to increased mistakes at closing, which really just leads to that bad customer experience. Defects are costly to both settlement agents and lenders. For instance, lenders have entire departments dedicated to curing closing and post-closing issues, which obviously incur a very large operational cost. Also, direct monetary loss could be experienced due to fee refunds, remediations, and other cures for those defects. Closing defects lead to costly compliance violations, and when pertinent lender or investor requirements are missed, originators may be stuck with an unsaleable loan or a buyback. It's no wonder that all of these things often show up on survey results from customers related to a poor customer experience. Next slide. So how do we fix it? What's the solution? Oh, sorry, we can go on to the next slide. Is that a duplicative slide? Yeah, I think we've got, that one's duplicative. Maybe we can, I think we have a copy paste issue here. But I can just speak to it. So what did we decide to do? Here's where we focused our attention in terms of coming up with a solution. As Jim previously alluded to, Alta and MBA supported the creation of our development working group, which was called the MISMO Closing Instructions Development Group. That group was kicked off, it's hard to believe, in late 2017. And as Jim stated, was really combined with all the players in the lending and title ecosystem. We were very lucky to have such great representation. It allowed for some great conversations to happen, to really think through what we wanted to do and what our plan of attack would be. And what we came up with were two different templates, a master closing instructions template and a transactional closing instructions template. And we'll go into a little bit more detail about those in just the next slide. We also came up with a comprehensive implementation guide. And our thinking, again, was not to define the words on the page, but to define kind of the bumpers on the runway. Really come up with that template of the key topics that should be addressed in each of the various templates, and then go into further detail within the implementation guide on suggestions of what information would fall within those key templates. One thing that we talked at great detail about was trying to maintain the totality of the template itself. And again, we'll go into a little bit more into the future slides. But if there is a section that perhaps isn't relevant to a particular lender, to maintain that section and that section header and put language in NA, not applicable, C, supplemental document. And that allows for that, that increased consistency from a settlement agent perspective. So even if, it reduces the need for that settlement agent or that escrow agent to reach out to their lender thinking maybe something was omitted in error, and lets them continue to flow through and read the instructions consistently, lender over lender, loan over loan. Jim, with that, next slide, I will turn it back to you and we can start talking through the actual structure of the templates themselves.
Great, thanks, Kate. So Kate mentioned that the work group started in late 2017, and at our first meetings, we had a lot of discussion amongst the group, providing all of the different perspectives on how everybody involved in the closing saw the closing. And what we realized pretty quickly in those conversations is that it was very clear that people who wrote the instructions, the lender group, thought they knew what escrow officers did at the closing, and that escrow officers correspondingly thought they knew what lenders wanted with their closing instructions. And it became very clear very quickly that neither of us had the slightest clue what each other was doing. And so we spent a lot of time level setting between the two of them, the two groups, and the people who wrote the systems really were amazed that we didn't really understand each other very well, and they didn't understand any of us because they write code, right? So what we also did is we reviewed a lot of different loan instructions. We had a very core group that did a ton of research, and special call out to Ruth Dillingham on this. She put together a package of double-digit numbers of loan closing instructions that we reviewed as a group, and we started to talk about what we liked and what we didn't like about both the architecture of those closing statements and the content of those closing statements. And we came pretty quickly to a model where we had, we wanted to create templates for the closing instructions that broke into two parts. One was the master closing instructions, which was the repository for those items that the lender was going to want to have happen with every single transaction, regardless of type and deal structure for that particular closing. And then the other group were the transactional closing instructions, and those would include all of the information and all of the requirements that were specific to the transaction that was going to be closed as part of this transaction. And there are some reasons for that, and we'll go through a little bit on the next few slides why we treated it that way. And so what we've included is examples of those different closing instructions to go over here and to give a sense of what we were thinking behind that. So Jeremy, if you go to the next slide. So we're going to first talk about the master instructions. And this is, I mean, we've got the whole master instruction here that we'll go through over the course of several pages, but this talks about kind of what we're thinking about what's contained in those instructions. And you can see kind of a laundry list of the stuff that that is gonna be addressed here. But the consistent piece to this is those items do not change from closing to closing. This is the lender's rules of the road around all of their closings. And we broke it into four parts. The first part, and they're A, B, C, and D. And the first general category are those requirements that are applicable to the settlement agents. And these are the expectations that that lender has for you as the settlement agent on how they want you to work with them and how you want you to work with their customers. So you can see, for example, purpose of the closing instructions, that's kind of a very generalized thing, but what kind of communication they want? Do they want you to be calling them? Do they want you to be emailing them? How do they want you to be communicating with that lender? And it could include how they want you to communicate with their customer as well. What their compliance expectations are, what their expectations are around data security and document destruction post-closing. Next slide, please, Jeremy. And you can see the rest of the list of how they want you to be working with that transaction. And then the section B are general closing requirements. These are going to be things like who's going to prepare the borrower closing disclosure, who's going to prepare the seller disclosure, who's going to prepare the settlement. Do they even want a settlement statement? Do you have to provide that to them? All of that should be addressed in these sections of the closing instructions. Next slide. Then there's some items regarding what are they going to typically want in the way of information or additional documentation. on every deal. Do they want a closing protection letter on every deal? Are they going to generally want survey coverage? What do they want you to do about taxes and other charges, hazard insurance, et cetera? How do they want, what kind of notarization do they want, and additional affirmation? As you can see, these are how do they want you to handle the closing itself under these instructions for every single closing that they do. Next page, Jeremy. Continuing along the same vein. Interestingly here, this is an area where you might see that there's a statement about, for instance, powers of attorney in the master closing instructions. There may actually also be a statement about the power of attorney in the transactional closing instructions. There are places where the lenders were very clear as a group, and I think as a settlement agent, we were also clear. We want to know the general rules of the road, but also with respect to the individual transaction, we may want some detail about that individual transaction. So for instance, powers of attorney, does that lender have to approve that power of attorney, or are they okay if you approve it on your own? They're going to generally say what the rule is here. And then in the transactional instructions, if that lender has to approve it, they may actually put in the transactional instruction, there is a power of attorney and we have reviewed it, it is not a condition to close. Or on the other side of the road, they might say, there's been an indication there may be a power of attorney. We have not reviewed it in this instance, and that is a condition to close. So there are places where there's some overlap between the master instructions and the transactional instructions. Next page. We've also anticipated a few things here. B13 talks about electronic closings. There are a lot of lenders that are not allowing electronic closings there, and that may actually be the full extent of that particular item for the master closing instructions. But we do suspect that that's coming. And so we wanted to make a place for it so that we didn't have to revise this right out of the gate. And I think we're already seeing some movement on that area. We're seeing more and more lenders approving electronic closing. So what are their rules of the road about this? Section C talks about post-closing requirements. What does the lender expect on all of their deals around recordings, settlement disbursements, what to do about refunds and shortages. Next slide. How do they want their documents returned? Which documents do they want to return? And then section D are definitions. And as you can see, that's completely blank. It's up to the lender to determine which terms they want defined and how they want to define those. There will be, with respect to the master closing instructions, I think you'll see a couple different patterns develop here, and the work group was not specific about what, we give the lender a lot of leeway about how often and how they want to distribute these master closing instructions. There will be some lenders that distribute them just once, maybe once a year or once every period, whatever that period might be, annually, quarterly, monthly, et cetera, et cetera. There may be lenders that want to deliver a set of master closing instructions with every transaction, and that's okay too. We're not dictating the cadence of the distribution of these master closing instructions from the working group. We do think there'll probably be some patterns that develop, and you'll see maybe one or two or three different buckets that happens in. But as a general rule, there's no requirement that those be distributed on a regular basis, or that they can't be distributed with every transaction. Next slide, please. So the transactional closing instructions are a little busier, and they kind of have to be, because this is all of the information regarding, I don't know if, you threw me there for a second, Jeremy. It has all of the information relative to the participants in the loan, and details about the property and the rest, and the lender's requirements around the loan. And there was a lot of discussion about where on the document all of these items would be placed. And we tried to put the most important stuff on the first page or two. And there was general agreement that the most important item was who's the borrower and how do we want them to take title. And so you can see there's a lot of detail in this particular, and we're trying to call out very clearly, even though we're not putting any words on the page, we're trying to be very clear to lenders creating these instructions exactly what it is we want in this, particularly where it's important that it be known what it is that we want, so that as a settlement officer, you can expect, you will very quickly, after dealing with 3 or 4 of these, you'll know exactly where to look in these transactional closing instructions to find what it is that you need to look for. So you can see from that first page, the borrower information, vesting, and the property information right up the top. These instructions will go for every loan, and it will have all of the data that you'll need to close that particular transaction. You need to do it under the constrictions of the master instructions that apply generally to all the loan, but these are the instructions for this particular deal. Next page. So you can see they get kind of busy here, but we're very specific about what we need on these transactions. The information about the loan, information about the lender, and at this point, you know exactly. I think if you look in the middle of that lender information slot, you can see this is who you call if you have questions. And that may be, from a settlement officer's point of view, the most important piece of information here is, if I have any questions, who do I call and how do I get a hold of them? And you've got your phone number, your email address, and a mailing address for that person. You also can check to make sure you're the right person to be closing this, because the settlement information, settlement agent information, and title agent information will be there too. Next page. Again, critical dates, your title insurance requirements. We all know that not every lender knows exactly what all of those requirements are. There are a lot of times they're parroting what the investor wants. We tried to be very explicit about the information here, what they want in the way of policies, whether they want a CPL. Again, if you remember back to the master instructions, CPL was addressed in the master instructions. It's also addressed here in the transactional instructions. Next page. We tried to be explicit about some of the conditions and stipulations. There was some fear that we're going to be putting ideas into lenders' heads about conditions and stipulations, but by and large, these were pretty typical list of items, and obviously if they don't apply, the lender can also always put in not applicable or not for this loan, whatever language they want to say, this is not a condition or stipulation that applies on this particular loan. But we've got a whole laundry list of potential conditions and steps that might apply to that particular loan. Next page.
Jim, this is Kate. I would just jump in while we're going to the next page. It wasn't as apparent on the slide prior, but when talking to our working group around conditions and stipulations, one thing that was very clear was that some lenders had limitations, or some LOS systems had limitations as to how they could display this information. So when you look at the template itself, you'll see a large blank area in the conditions and steps as it initiates, and then it goes into this itemized list. The reason for that was some lenders said they sort of had to dump the information directly out of their LOS into one area, and at least day one wouldn't be able to leverage this itemized list. So we wanted to make sure, adoption is our #1 goal, and adoption as quickly as possible. So we wanted to be flexible and allow a lender, if they need just that large white section, to put all their stipulation language there in conditions. But if their system allowed, and it was about a 50-50 split, if their system allowed for them to itemize it, that they would use that section as opposed to just that large white section. So just wanted to call that out. Thanks, Jim.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. That brings up a point that was interesting from my point of view as being on the settlement side of this, is that the loan operating systems were a real mixed bag. You had some, some vendors that served a large groups of populations, like Ellie Mae with their Encompass project or Doc Magic. But then you also had the large lenders, by and large, had proprietary systems that they were the only customer. I mean, they built them in-house and they were the only customer. And there was a wide variety or wide range of the ability to make changes within those systems. And it became apparent very clearly, very early on, that one of the impediments to implementation of this was that transactional cost, or the cost of changing those systems around. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move forward towards to the adoption discussion. But Kate's right. We did as much as we could within these documents, to make them amenable to being incorporated into those various systems. This page is just a continuation of some of the stuff that you're going to see on the instructions. The idea behind these spaces is that with some of the systems, we expect that those will be expandable and contractible, so that if there's nothing in that space, in addition to saying not applicable, they could drop it down to a single line to make the instructions shorter. The key is everything will be in the same order, regardless of how large or small it is for that particular transaction. Next page. And this is the last page of the transactional instructions. And you can see that we've kind of tried to address it in order of priority and also in order of the flow of the way things work. So from the beginning of the closing to the end of the closing, which means the wire transfer amount, which is one of the last things we do, will be, and return document return will be the last things on the closing instructions. So those are the general templates, the master and the transactional templates. And then let's go back one more, Jeremy. I want to talk a little bit about the implementation guide, because this is, at the end of the day, we spent a lot of time talking about this implementation guide, or the I-guide as it's referred to in MISMO speak. The I-guide is a document that is a MISMO unique document. They do an I-guide with every MISMO group that results in some sort of publication. And the purpose of the I-guide, as you can see, this is the page, one page of the I-guide with respect to master closing instructions. And as you can see from that, they take a section, and what we did is we talked about why that section exists. And the whole point of it is to provide guidance to the lender, and even more particularly the person at that lender who is drafting the text of these, to talk about the concept that we're trying to reach by that heading. So probably the first one's a little bit obtuse, but if you go to the second item, A2, communication, we've got some very specific language that talks about what that lender should be telling the closing agent about how they want that agent to communicate with them regarding their transactions. And if you just read through those items, it becomes very specific about what we're trying to have that lender tell that settlement agent, so that they can use whatever language they want, but please address these concepts when you're writing those closing instructions. And that was the compromise, and I think the real vehicle that we came to that made this work. So what we're going to see is, you're not going to see identical language from lender to lender. That may happen over the course of several years, but what you're going to see is in every time you look at that section, the same concepts should be being addressed in the way that that lender wants them addressed. So you're not going to eliminate all variations between closing instructions, but what you're going to do is pretty clearly know from this section, if I want to know how they want me to be communicating with how they want me to communicate to that lender, you're going to go to this section and that language will address that issue. And that's the way the iGuide works for the master closing instructions, and that's the way it works for the transactional instructions. Every place there is a number and a letter, they're going to have instructions on how to address that particular issue. All right, next slide. So Kate, you want to take it from here?
Absolutely. So again, just to recap kind of why now and why did we go down the MISMO path? You know, in generating this development work group, we all saw a bit of irony that when you look at the loan application process some time ago, there was industry standardization in that space where the information is different loan to loan, but it's always located in the same spot. So when you look at that, and then as we've already talked about, you see the wide variation in closing instructions today. Some are 2 pages, some are 32 pages. You know, information on endorsements might be on the first page for lender A, on the 33rd page for lender B, which is really just causing additional complexity and stress in the loan closing process. You know, the settlement agent is constantly searching for information, which might not even be there at all. And so we just thought it made more sense to try to put some commonality in here and really leverage the governance and the structure of MISMO as a standardization organization to help us really craft that and then also help us maintain it for years to come. Next slide. So I am very, very, very excited to say that the templates are finalized, have gone through public comment periods, and are available for use. So included in the presentation is the link to the templates themselves. And really, as Jim said, the work that he and I shared for this process has come to an end. Now, that does not mean that the work group is closed or done. It's actually just pivoted to what we always knew would be a phase 2, which is to take the templates, the information within the templates, and map that against the MISMO data reference model, which is, you know, a ginormous data dictionary that MISMO maintains. As Jim said before, it's now probably very clear to all of you why Jim and I are no longer chairing this development work group. We handed it over to very confident folks in the data space, but there's definitely still a need for participation from the title and settlement and escrow industry. You know, specifically title loan operating systems would love engagement there, but really still do need that business focus as well as the mapping continues to make sure that things are understood from a data perspective and how they're used, and so that then in turn can be mapped appropriately. If you go to the mismo.org site, there is a community page, and you can search for the Closing Instructions Development Work Group and join the community. They have calls typically every other week, I believe. Oh gosh, are they Thursdays? I think in the afternoon. But all the information for the development work group is available through the MISMO site. If you have any questions, you can always reach out to me, and I can get you connected with the wonderful folks from a MISMO organization perspective that can help you navigate through the site if needed. Next slide. So where do we go from here? You know, as has been, you know, front and center on both my mind and Jim's mind, is that adoption is really what we're focusing on. And that's adoption from all of the lenders. So big banks, regional lenders, adoption from the software providers. So really the focus of MBA right now is to get the message out and try to find those that can quickly adopt, and also work with those to schedule in any changes that would be required technically within their various release calendars. So that, again, has been the focus of MBA and MISMO jointly, and will continue to be over the next coming months. I think the other thing that's really important is talk to your lenders. You know, the more that we can talk about this as an ecosystem, the more successful we'll be from an adoption perspective. So are your lenders aware that these are available? You know, what does their time frame look like to adopt? You know, what's the benefit to them in terms of, you know, reduced defects, potential lower operational costs, more efficiency in the closing experience, an improved customer experience, which leads to, repeat business for all involved. So I think the more that we can create that awareness and hype around these templates, the more adoption we will have and the more efficiency we'll have in the overall process. Jim, I'll turn it back over to you if you have any other thoughts on next steps, and then we can open it up for questions.
Yeah, I think it's really important that we be talking about this to our customers and to our lender customers so that they understand that this is there. They may want to be talking to their software providers if it's a smaller or regional bank. And I think the real benefit here at the end of the day for everybody is that we end up with a much enhanced consumer experience. That makes everybody's lives a lot easier, both from a referral point of view and from a regulatory point of view. I think this is a huge benefit that for the industry if there is widespread adoption. And so I think it's a great opportunity to provide a customer service for those lenders to have them push for the adoption of these instructions. So I think that might be it. Jeremy, do we have any questions?
All right, Kate and Jim, thanks for detailing the templates and then really wrapping up and explaining what title and settlement agents can be doing now and starting those conversations with our lenders to help raise awareness about these and then also get an idea as far as implementation timeline. Actually, I have had quite a few questions already come in, so we'll pitch those to the speakers, and then if you have a question, feel free to submit it in the questions box. We got about 10, 15 minutes here. One simple question here is, so are these going to be used for residential transactions, or can these be applied to commercial as well?
Our focus was residential, but I don't know why they couldn't potentially apply in the commercial space as well. There might need to be, MISMO is more involved in the commercial space, so that's probably something good to take back to the MISMO staff to see if the commercial teams would want to take a look at it. But I think it at least could be a jumping off point from commercial, but our focus was primarily residential.
Okay.
Right.
And then kind of a common theme, getting a lot of questions, Kate, probably for you, and maybe what you're hearing from the lending community as far as implementation timelines, and if you know about any lenders that have kind of got this teed up for 2021.
I know that most of my peer-sized lenders are working with their implementation and technical teams to get these scoped into release. I can personally say that myself and Sally Frudenberg and some others within Wells Fargo are looking to do that very thing. Within our enterprise release calendar, are hoping to have adoption in 2021.
Okay.
I can also say, Jeremy, that since the adoption of the templates, Kate and myself, and then a couple resources from MBA and MISMO have had several outreach calls to regional lenders across the country. We've probably got, Kate, between 10 and 20 different regional lenders across the country that we've had specific outreach conversations with. And we also have had extensive conversations with the loan operating system providers. And we think that has real potential for this, particularly if we can get this to a place where there is kind of a standard set of instructions that go with the standard package that those loan operating systems provide. We don't know that that's the case yet, but we've pressed them pretty hard on that. And if that's the case, and they all have, the form that you saw today was built by one of those loan operating system companies. They have great tools to provide these, and we do think that they're going to put that in their package of documents, and we think there is going to be some adoption as lenders either change or upgrade their loan operating systems, that this will start rolling out across the country.
Definitely will be a drip campaign, ongoing effort. Any input or knowledge as far as outreach to more of the community banks and credit unions?
that's where we need the help of this community. We have, we've talked to the various industry groups. Kate has been tireless in her talks around the country on this particular issue. I've done more talking to the title folks, but we know that all of those groups, there's been outreach to all of those groups, but really the best way to talk about that is to have our team, our people talking to their customers saying, hey, here's a great idea for you, and it's going to tee it up for maybe doing some electronic transfer of this information if you start using these forms.
Yeah, so I mean, great point. Go to the MISMO site, download the documents, and have that conversation with your lending partners.
Yeah.
Actually, Jim, Ruth commented the work group is working on getting the mapping done as soon as possible for commercial LOS systems. So there we go.
Yeah. Ruth could have been a third presenter on this and maybe done a better job than both of us.
She probably should have been the presenter, actually, right there.
Exactly.
All right. Here's an interesting question from Luana. A lot of times, when settlement agents are getting instructions, it's kind of last minute. But any conversation about creating a standard time frame for when the closing instructions are sent to the title agent? So the 3 days. Yeah, go ahead.
We kind of studiously avoided anything that was going to create a conflict between the groups, and that's something that's really the place of a regulator. That's not the place of this particular group. We did everything we could to avoid conflict, to avoid having this project fail. And while we did have some very robust discussions about things, we did a great job, and I'll credit Kate for this. It was a very collaborative group, and so we didn't want to do things that started to create mandates. We'll leave that to other groups, but we wanted to get this in place. We wanted to put a stake in the ground so that we had something to start from that everybody agreed on. And there will be conflicts, I'm sure, between the industries going forward as negotiations get more specific, but this is a good start. And that's what we wanted to do here.
Yep, definitely. Actually, you mentioned, Jim, there was a lot of foresight on the forms with the line talking about the e-closing or digital closing. And we've seen a big push for remote online notarizations or variations of digital closings. Is there any additional detail a title or settlement agent may be looking for on that line, maybe in regard to a RON?
Go ahead, Kate.
I was going to say we paced along with the RON work group within MISMO to try to account for some of the key pieces of not just RON, but digital closing, be it hybrid, whatever it might look like. And then tried to be in our iGuide, just thinking of other things, hindsight being 2020. Who would have thought when we were creating that iGuide that here's where we'd be, in November of 2020. But I think the topic header exists and allows for the lender to put the information regardless of the type of digital experience that would be occurring, whether it's they don't do them or we do them in these scenarios or we do hybrid. And then to complement that, in the transactional guide, there's also an e-closing section where they can outline their expectations in their entirety.
Okay.
I'd add on a couple of points to that too. One is that, we're never going to be able to encompass everything that's going to happen within a closing in these instructions. We're trying to get 90, 95%. And the second thing is these MISMO documents are living documents. And so, we certainly didn't see ourselves as trying to think of or thinking about everything that could happen or could happen in the future. But the documents can be amended going down the road. And, that means that there's going to have to be changes to the documents that get used by the various companies or by the various lenders across the country. They're going to have to continue to make those changes as the industry develops over time. But we do think that we did a good job of capturing what we see today and what we can see on the horizon. I'm sure there are things that are over the horizon that we did not address in these.
Yeah, good point, Jim. Definitely living documents that will have to be modified and updated in the future. Any thoughts either of you may have on input from the GSEs, Fannie and Freddie, and maybe what they think about the instructions?
Yeah, they actually participated in most of our sessions that happened in conjunction with MISNL summits. So spring, fall, winter summits, we had at least one, if not multiple participants from both Fannie and Freddie, and they were very supportive of the work that we were doing and really were just pacing with us to understand next steps, but didn't raise any concerns, at least verbally, during those sessions. But it was exciting to have them there.
Mm-hmm. Good.
They were big proponents of the next phase too. The electronic, the data point mapping, because they see that as at the end of the day, they see that as a tool to have a better closing experience and a better understanding of what the lender wanted from the closing officer going forward.
Yeah, and they definitely like to reduce risk in the transaction.
Yep.
Here's a good question from Ethan, and take maybe a couple more, then wrap up today. And Ethan asks, any idea about what will be the method by which a lender communicates a change in the standard part of their instructions? So that, for example, if a lender routinely sends both parts of the instructions and the title agent is accustomed to ignoring the standard part, what will trigger the title agent to take a fresh look at the standard part of the instructions?
I think that's where it's going to be really important that the settlement agent is routinely meeting with their lender, because, and this is just case opinion only, but I think it's going to vary. I think when you initially are working with a lender, I think that's a really important question to ask. What is your frequency for sending out your master closing instructions? And will that frequency change if there is a change? For example, maybe lender A decides they're going to send out their master closing instructions annually, but in the event that there's a change, they would send it out immediately upon, determination of said change. So I think that that's something that I don't think it'll be unanimous across lenders, but I absolutely think that that is something when you're having this initial conversation and your lenders are looking to adopt this dual template format, understanding, are they going to highlight it? Is it going to be in a different font color? Is it just that they would send them out more frequently? So that your team members are able to quickly identify those changes.
Good advice.
I'd have a couple of comments on that question too, Jeremy. One is to the title agent. I would say ignoring the master instructions on a regular basis is a big risk. Do that at your own risk. And I think the other part of it is it is going to give the lender needs to be very strategic about how they distribute those master closing instructions. Kate's a little too shy. Wells Fargo does a fabulous job of regularly communicating to their settlement agents, and her partner in crime, Sally Freudenberg, does a nice job of communicating with agents, both as to how they're doing and what their expectations are, and then communicating changes that they make. And they do that both in their master instructions. They already do. Wells already has a master and transactional specific. We didn't do that because that's the way they did it. We did it because people liked it. But they do a nice job of communicating when there's a change with that within their master closing instructions by both doing it in the instructions, resending those instructions, and then sending on top of that an additional communication. Banks are going to have to think about how they do this so that that can be as clear as possible for their closing agents.
All right. Well, Kate and Jim, thank you for this discussion. Again, if we didn't cover something, or if you have a question, feel free to shoot me an email, and I'll forward it on to Jim and Kate. My email, jyowie@alta.org. And again, just use this as an opportunity to reach out to your lenders, and have a conversation with them on their implementation plans, and the benefits of using these as well. If you did miss parts of today's webinar, or if you think others in your office would benefit from listening, it is being recorded, and you'll get an email with a link to the recording tomorrow. And you can always go to alta.org/webinars to access our webinar archive. Looking ahead to some upcoming presentations, next week we'll hold an election roundup on November 18th. On December 19th, we'll have a presentation about changes to the ALTA loan and owners policies, as well as numerous other forms. And then on December 15th, we will have a discussion on consumer privacy rights and redaction trends. So no shortage of content coming over the next month. And again, you can find registration info at alta.org/webinars. And with that, that will bring us to the conclusion of today's presentation. To wrap up, I need to thank F&F Family and Companies once again for sponsoring our Title Topics webinars. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.